Cool. All right, can everybody hear me pretty well, I think? Just so that I have an idea, how many people in the audience are русскоговорящие? Raise your hand. It's almost, I could have read it in Russian, but I won't. It's going to be in English, but if you need something explained in Russian, I can do that too. All right, the comic has absolutely nothing to do with my presentation. It's just there so that you had something to look at while you waited. Before I get to anything else, even introducing myself, I want to tell a brief story about a city that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, Великий Novgorod, which in the old days, which is the Middle Ages, had the title Господин Великий Новгород, Lord Novgorod the Great. As far as I know, it was the only Russian city with that title. And the reason it had it was that it was a very big, prosperous city, one of the largest republics in Europe, period, not just in Russia, and one of the wealthiest cities in Russia with a connection to the Hanseatic League, an office in the German quarter, and all of that. So it was a big deal, but they had a lot of problems, the biggest of which culminated with Moscow basically destroying them. And there's a question of why, right? Why, when Moscow is this little upstart backwater? I mean, where does it even come from? Why are we here? It's because it sits in a pretty decent place to control the waterways. And anyways, this is just a picture before we get to that. On the left, your left, you see Novgorod. You can tell because, first of all, God is on their side, right, with the angel up there cutting people. And for the second, these round nimbi, which you probably think, as I did just a week ago, mean sanctity, they don't. Those aren't saints. That's the sign of eternity. And the reason is Novgorod was supposed to be around forever, right? But it isn't. And the reason it isn't is because it has one big problem. The problem being that it can't grow its own food. It's too far north. You can see Novgorod up there on Lake Ladoga. You can get plenty of fur animals. You can grow some corn, but you at the population that it was at in the Middle Ages, with the technology they had, there was no way to grow enough wheat. And so they shipped their wheat from Suzdal over here, right along the river. And then you get to about here and you have to switch riverways. And you have to switch whatever's in that boat into another boat and bring it up to Novgorod. And that place was their vulnerability. It's called Tarzhok. Ignore this map. This is about the Mongol invasion. Don't look at all the arrows. But you can see here's Tarzhok, Suzdal, and Novgorod. So whatever grain was coming would come to Tarzhok, switch right to another river, and come up to Novgorod. And this was tons and tons of grain, tons of other things. And here's what happened. Anytime anybody wanted to attack Novgorod, they would come to Tarzhok. They wouldn't go to Novgorod because Novgorod has a huge army. You can see they even have angels with swords who are cutting people down. You don't want to attack Novgorod. You come to Tarzhok and you just sit there and you stop shipments of grain. And what happens is after a while, Novgorod sends some minor nobleman, right, says some city official to make some deal. It doesn't work. They send they send a bayar. Nobody listens to the bayar, so eventually they send the archbishop, and 9 times out of 10 they capitulate to whatever this person wanted. This is from the Chronicle of 1215, when Yaroslav, Knyaz Yaroslav, the son of Всеволод Большое Гнездо, in all the succession crisis that follows that, decides to pay Novgorod back for some treason, right? He's not even really trying to get anything. They've already elected him prince at this point. And he just comes and he stops the grain. It says that same autumn much harm was done. Frost killed the corn crops. By corn, this is an old translation, they mean basically everything, right, throughout the district. But at Tarzhok, because it's a little bit further south, all remained whole. The knyaz seized all the corn and would not let one cartload into the city. And in Novgorod, it was very bad, right? And what do we see? We see hyperinflation on food. So a barrel of rye for 10 hryvnias, one of oat for however many hryvnias, turnips. They ate leaves and moss Oh, brothers, then was the trouble. They gave their children into slavery. They dug a public grave, and so on and so forth. And obviously the obligatory and "za grihi nashe," for our sins, is really why it happened. But this isn't the only time it happens. It happened before this in 1139. It happens after this in 1312, 1540. That was just some of the dates I found when I was searching the Chronicle. And there are more. There are mass graves under Novgorod's main squares. So those famous cathedral squares are actually graves of people who died when some prince decided to come to Torzhok and stop the flow of grain. And so despite being famous for self-sufficiency, being famous for being independent, right, for having a veche, their motto was "Who against God and Novgorod the Great? Кто против Бога и Великого Новгорода?" Right? And they still, when it comes down to it, after they've had their glory day, they still obey Moscow. And that famous bell is taken away from the veche. And not that Novgorod is such a bad city today; it's a nice city, but they don't, their whole independence is hostage to their geographical situation. And so, in a sense, it's our first example to get to the title of this talk of a food island. In that sense, there's a parallel I can draw from my own experience. My family lived in Puerto Rico for a couple of years before the hurricane happened in the Caribbean Sea. And there you have a similar thing, right? All the food that's on the island is imported from Florida. It comes in a ship. Now, Novgorod's obviously not a literal island, but in Puerto Rico, so all the food is very expensive. The one difference is that if you cut off completely the flow of goods into Puerto Rico, at any time of year you could go into the jungle and find some plantains to eat, and it would be okay. In Novgorod, once the fall is over and you don't have griby and yagody and something from the forest, that's it, right? That's it. So, and if you can't feed your people, then all of your ideals about being a Christian republic, all of your ideals about being independent, about being a republic, none of that matters. None of that matters. Okay, so just keep this story in mind, in the back of your head. It'll become relevant at some point, I promise. But now I'll tell you a tiny bit about myself and why I'm here. So I'm a Fulbright scholar. I got my bachelor's degree in history at Yale last year, which is why I started with history. I like history. And I came, right, I didn't know quite what to do with when I graduated, and I was looking at the Fulbright program. And at the same time, as I was looking at the Fulbright program and the open research study grants, I was seeing headlines like these all over our news, right? That there had been sanctions, counter-sanctions against food, right? Banning of European food imports and U.S. food imports in 2014. This was creating an amazing opportunity, right, for small farmers, for restaurant owners who were filling the gap with all sorts of local Russian products. What a marvelous thing. If only America would do this for small farmers, people were saying. And when I first got here, it looked like, right, and my goal was to see how true this was and what the sanctions were actually doing. Did small producers, small growers, restaurant owners, cheesemakers, whatever, did they feel like they were getting somewhere because of the sanctions? And you walk into Bavka or any number of places, White Rabbit, and it looks at first like everything is amazing. And so when I got here, I was like, yeah, they did it. Food self-sufficient, local farm-to-table movement because of sanctions. Wow, the story's true. But I looked a little bit closer. If you look at these lovely heirloom tomatoes, which are very delicious, if we were to zoom in, you would see that on the etiketka, on the whatever it's called, it says Azerbaijan, right? It doesn't say Russia. It says they're imported from Azerbaijan. So that was one off-putting thing. Let's see. You look at the cheese. That's right. This cheese, it's pretty amazing, right? What's happening? There is a renaissance of Russian food that's happening. This one won the gold medal at a blind tasting in France last year. For the first time any Russian cheese has won that gold medal since before the Russian Revolution, since before 19, right? So for over 100 years. I mean, that's pretty incredible. But if you talk to that, I talked to that cheesemaker. I was like, and и как санкции повлияли на все это? And he looked at me and he said, we don't say that word. У нас нету этого слова. And I talked to farmers, right? And I published stuff about farmers and how they're out there growing products for restaurants and everything. And here's what I found. Nobody really wanted to talk about the sanctions. And it's not for what would have been the interesting reason they don't want to talk, which is that they actually have an influence. It's actually that nobody really cares. Most of all of this, the local food movement, farm to table, whatever you want to call it, in Russia, and if we say in Russia, that mostly means in Moscow, because it's not like there's that much farm to table in Vladivostok. But most of that started before 2014, before the ban on food imports. This farmer started in 2012. The Lavka started in 2008. I talked to Vladimir Mukhin not too long ago. He's the chef at White Rabbit, which is not too far from here. If you want to go there afterwards, it's pretty good. On the list of the world's 50 best restaurants and everything. Well, before the sanctions, his menu was trying to promote Russian food and had a kilometer marking next to every product on the menu, right? So it's not like, it's not what I thought, and certainly what the headlines were saying back in 2014, which is that we banned food imports, and now all these amazing chefs are coming up with creative ways to deal with the crisis, and one of those is to use Russian food. That's not really what happened. And seeing as I didn't have much of a story and my hypothesis was completely wrong, and I didn't know what to do after that, other than keep talking to people, but I couldn't make any generalizations, because you talk to a few small farmers, you might even talk to a dozen. I talked to a lot, and they all have a different experience and they all have anecdotes for this and that, but you don't get any trends or any trend lines. And so I thought maybe I need to level up, so to speak, and look at a higher level industry, right? So because most of our food does not come from small farmers living the ideal peasant lifestyle somewhere. This was a bit, I'll just be honest, a little bit scary for me, because I don't like graphs. I've never taken an economics class. I didn't, unlike probably a lot of people in this room, I didn't want to look at the numbers. I was like, if I can just get this, if people can just tell me what's going on, I can write it down, but I didn't want to do my own research. But what I realized is that I would have to. Because that was the only way I was going to get some answers, the only way I was going to get some actual facts. Now, causes and effects become easier, right? Once you start looking at statistics. Remember, I was trying to figure, what's the cause of all these small farmers? Is it an effect of the sanctions? I couldn't answer that with much more than a maybe. But here, you can, so if we're going to talk about the effects of the sanctions, we can see those right away, right? Cost, U.S. chicken producers $303 million, and down the list. Poor Norway was sending us almost all of their fish, it looks like. No more, they're going to have to eat it, I guess. Poland, Netherlands, Spain, right? So you can see, and quite tremendous costs. I mean, it's going up into the billions of dollars, the low 1 billion number up there. But, so I'm thinking, great, this is an effect. But if you look at the percentage of GDP for each of these countries that those numbers entail, it's less than 1% for every country on that list, right? Which means not much of an effect. They'll figure out how to, deal with it, and go on. This graph is showing the exact same thing, right? It's misleading, though. First of all, none of the countries were particularly hard hit, again, because all of this is less than 1% of GDP. And I know every percent of GDP counts, but but less than 1% isn't all that much. European Union paid out a few subsidies and they were good. It is misleading, this particular graph, because the countries actually hardest hit as a share of GDP are the Baltics. And that might have been intentional or not, who knows. There's also some black market that's not reflected. I live in Sergiev Posad, and I went to the rynek there with a farmer who was trying to sell some Russian apples, right, varieties that have almost disappeared from the market, like Orlovsky Polosatый and Antonovka, all the stuff you can't buy. And he was going up to these Uzbek and Tajik salesmen and saying, okay, here I have these apples, do you want to take them? And they were like, no, we have all these apples from Poland. And that was this fall, right? And like, where did you get these apples? Oh, we trucked them through Belarus. We don't know, right, because it's a black market, so we have absolutely no statistics. But that's happening. And it's not just happening through Belarus, it's even continuing to happen through Ukraine. Just last week, I talked to a friend of a friend who's Armenian, who does a lot of odd jobs, one of which he worked as a trucker. And I was like, interesting, tell me about what part of the world you saw. And he was like, yes, I drove through Ukraine, hauling truckloads of food. And it was scary because they put you in a military convoy. And your documents are in order, but you just try to stare straight ahead and not look at the, sorry for the image, at the burning corpses on the side of the road. But so these borders are very porous. And so some, right, these are the official figures. They're probably even lower than that because some of the food is still making it through, especially from countries like Poland and from the Baltics. Okay, here is a real effect, right? If we're just going through the effects of the sanctions, huge food inflation in Russia. But I mean, all of you know this because you've been here. But food prices got pretty high. They went down a little bit, but mostly they stayed high, and wages of course didn't go up. Now, this is something that could have been predicted, which of course begs the question: was it predicted? And if so, what was the point? Right? If you know that it's not going to hurt the other person, but it is going to hurt you, what's the point of doing it? Anyways, I'm not going to answer that question. I don't know if there is an answer to that. This graph, by the way, shows the same thing because I started looking at where are exports increasing. Shouldn't exports from countries like Belarus be increasing? First of all, because of illegal shipments of apples, for example, coming through that are relabeled, but also because suddenly we've shut off a whole line of exports. We have to be compensating somewhere. Actually, no. You can see exports go down after 2014. And the reason they go down is because the real wage of Russians goes down, right? The ruble tanks, food becomes more expensive, and people just aren't buying as much stuff. And so Russian imports as a whole go down, not just from the EU, not just from the United States, but from everywhere. Okay, but so that was unfortunate. I was like, is there still an effect on the agricultural industry? And when I saw this, I thought, aha, perfect, real evidence that the sanctions stimulated Russian agricultural growth. Look at this, Rusagro, one of the biggest companies in Russia, 52% revenue growth the year the sanctions go into effect. That's $1.1 billion, right? That same $1 billion that we took away from Poland is now in the pocketbooks of Rusagro. Isn't that amazing? Talk about cause and effect. Here's the cause and there's the effect. It's perfect. But it turned out not to be quite so simple because 2014 is great, but when you extend the trend line back for basically every sector, as you'll see, of Russian agriculture, the growth starts way before that. Here's 2006 to 2018. You can see wheat going up and up and up. This is showing the same thing for wheat, corn, and barley, all the way from 2000 to, what is that, 2017, 18, right? The spikes, and we're just looking at the overall trend, right? But it goes down and up because there are droughts. That's kind of how agriculture works. But mostly we're just going up and up and up. And the really big thing happens here when Russia, right, we talked about the cheese. Here's a parallel with the cheese that won the medal in France. Russia becomes the world's leading grain exporter for the first time since the Russian Revolution of 1917. But don't forget that at the time of the Russian Revolution, Russia also included Belarus and Ukraine, which produce a ton of grain. So this is even more impressive than it sounds, because now the Russian Federation is producing all of this by itself. And we have this lovely quote that put it with the Novgorod story for later: "Grain is our second oil," from Alexander Tkachov, who was the agricultural minister at the time. But again, okay, 2000 to 2018, Russia, again, with those spikes still, right, with the dips and valleys because of droughts and whatever, grain exports are just going up and up and up. And you'll say, okay, so why are you telling us about wheat? Because that wasn't, that's not really what the embargo's about. That's not what the sanctions are about. I'm just starting with that because it's impressive. But if you look at other things, here's Russian meat imports, right? They start going down about 2007, and they just go down and down and down from whatever, this is in tons, I think, 3,500 almost, and all the way down year by year. We see this for, I'm just going to go through this fast because you don't really care about broilers probably, but broiler imports are going down. Turkey, right, production's going up. Imports are going down. Starting this graph starts in 2003, goes to 2012. We haven't even gotten to the sanctions yet. Look at how steep that trend line is. This was a FAO, Food and Agriculture of the UN report showing, and it showed self-sufficiency. It came out in early 2014 before the sanctions had actually been implemented, and they were worrying about Russian, self-sufficiency in meat back then, showing the trend line of self-sufficiency. This is for poultry. This is for pork. You can see it's going up as well in these years. This reminds me of an anecdote, just a brief digression. One of my acquaintances is a businessman, the president of the Canadian Association of Businessmen, even though he's actually in Moscow, even though he's from Nebraska. But he was working in for one of the companies, if he didn't own it, I'm not quite sure. Anyways, one of the companies that was one of the biggest importers of pork into Russia before 2014, from Canada mostly. And when 2014 hit, when they banned pork imports, his company started losing tons of money, thousands of dollars a day. Must not have been that big because it wasn't millions of dollars. But thousands of dollars a day starts to add up every month. And he told me that this one little thing saved them. There had been an employee of the company, a Russian employee, right? It was a foreign company, but they had a Russian employee who was one of the lower level executives. And he was stealing money from the company for years and years. And they finally figured out what he was doing with the money, which is he was investing it into pig farms. He was building pig farms. And they couldn't, so they knew he was stealing. They knew why he was doing the pig farms. He always justified it by saying, I'm giving, your company has a 49% stake in the pig farms. And the company was like, we're an import business. These pig farms are losing money, which they were, every year. That's our money, which you're taking. And we don't want a stake in it. But they couldn't fire him because for whatever reason he was needed at the company. And then 2014 hit, and this company is basically bankrupt. They were big importers, and now they have no product. And then they look around and they see, wait, we have these pig farms. There's a guy that we all hated built, and now there's a gap in the market, and we can start producing. And as far as I understand it, what they did is they vertically integrated with Miratorg, and now they're doing just fine. They started producing. So out of a happy mistake for them. Anyways, going on, livestock production, right? What do we see? We don't see that after 2014 things are going up. We see everything's going down until you get to 2000, and then everything's going up, except for cattle, but that's a separate story, which we won't talk about. Okay, this is what I found, and some of you, maybe all of you, know about this. Certainly, if you grew up in Russia, this couldn't have been something that was hidden from you. It was hidden from me, which is why I'm talking about it. I just didn't know how long the history of import substitution, self-sufficiency, and so on, импортозамещение, right, has been a topic in Russian politics. Right, 2003 was the first established meat quota in Russia to try to limit meat imports, and they renewed it in 2009. In 2009, with growing exports, they decided to make the Northern Sea route a priority. Both Rosgraniцы and the National Security Council had it on their agendas that year. 2010 is the implementation of the Food Security Doctrine. Raise your hand if you've heard of this. Really? Oh, okay. Good, good. So I didn't want to come to this lecture and say things people already knew. So good. 2010 is the Food Security Doctrine, which we didn't know they had. 2013, sort of probably as a practice run for 2014, Russia bans all dairy from Lithuania for 2 months. And then they do it permanently in 2014. 2017, right, so we think 2014 we're all done, right? You think the motivation for the sanctions was to get back at the EU and the US for their sanctions, right? That's why they're called kontrsankции. No. In 2017, Brazil is now the exclusive exporter to Russia of 90% of the pork that Russia is still importing, which is not a lot, right? Russia restricts that in 2017. 2018, the food sanctions are extended till 2019, but we think they'll go further probably. And 2022 is the stated goal of self-sufficiency in food, right? And it's coming up, so we'll be around to see it. Okay. This was surprising to me because in Western media, and I think to some extent even in Russian media, the sanctions of 2014 are talked about like this singular event, these kontrsankции. There's a lot of focus on them. Dare I say, there's a lot of propaganda of all sorts, both good and bad and otherwise. There's just a misunderstanding of what it's actually all about, and I want to get to some of them, what I think are the motivations. But first, let's talk about the food security doctrine. My highlights disappeared. I had nice highlights here that showed you which part of this to look at, but I'll just tell you. I don't think that. Yeah. Okay. This is just from Kremlin.ru, a very informative website. The food security doctrine approved 2010. What are the highlights here? Aims to guarantee reliable food supplies. Okay. Obviously, develop agriculture, external threats, blah blah blah. Risks and threats. Okay, stability is in here somewhere. I know it is, right? Stability, the big theme. Threshold values for grain, sugar, potatoes, fish. For some reason, the things we like to eat here. For some reason, cabbage isn't in there, but it's possible we already produce most of our own cabbage, right? So domestic. When Russians are talking about food production as a or food security as a policy, domestic production, stability, and reliability of food supplies are up there at the top. I want to compare this with the United States Department of Agriculture guidelines for food security. Okay, USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the department in the U.S. that's in charge of agriculture, obviously. What do they say about food security? First of all, it's the third word. USDA supports global food security. Immediately an emphasis, right? Russia was domestic. The United States is talking about global food security right off the bat. Okay, building applied research and blah, 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 sufficient nutritious. Okay, global food security, again, sustainable economic growth and long-term economic prosperity. Right, both of those countries that have food security problems and the United States. As we help countries become more food secure and raise incomes, we also expand markets for American producers. Which is to say what, right? And then a list of how much food we're exporting to Africa. For the United States, what ensures food security, right? I shouldn't say for the United States. For this particular section of the USDA website, right? Because there are lots of websites, lots of policies. But what we see in this paragraph is that for the United States, food security is when you can afford to buy food. So you want incomes to be higher, both at home and in developing countries, because once they're higher, they'll be able to afford to buy food. And who's going to provide that food? Obviously, American farmers under this vision. So it's not, this is very different from Russia, which is concerned about domestic policies and what we saw, the verbatim supply of food. And that wasn't my translation, that's the translation of whoever works at the Kremlin. Okay, remember that, so part of the Russian strategy is ports. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but climate change, however much President Putin doesn't like climate change because it's killing his favorite animal species, and I really do think he loves animals, but I'm sure he's also happy that it's melting the ice up here because that's going to give Russia a lot of new coastline and a lot of places to ship food, because right now, these are our main places we can ship food, and look how long this land route is, right? This is not very effective, even though Russia has a lot of trains and a lot of railroad tracks, and that's awesome. But we don't. Even Moscow to Novorossiysk is, even Moscow to St. Petersburg. It's not ideal. It's not ideal, and especially not ideal. I talked to a representative of X5, one of the largest retail companies in Russia, and he'd worked in the agriculture and food import and export business for 20 years, and he said that he thinks Russia is really trying to crack down on and close the Baltic ports right now, because those are seen as a strategic weakness. So right now, a lot of food goes through Baltic ports, a lot. But if we're able to get some more ports up north, especially get them modernized, and obviously improve strategic things, down south in Novorossiysk and etc., right? Then we'll be able to circumvent the Baltic countries. We won't need them anymore. And again, there might be multiple motivations why we don't want them. I'm not going to talk about those. I think you can guess. The role the Baltics play in all of this, I think, is outsized, but that's not really the topic. Maybe in questions we can talk about that. So the motivation, right? Why is all this happening? Why is there a food security doctrine? Why, since the early 2000s, has Russia been trying to become self-sufficient in food production? Why? And you'll say, well, it's obvious. Why are you lecturing? Russia doesn't want to be reliant on other countries. Period. Okay, but it's not that simple. Think about all the rich, powerful countries that do import tons of food, like the United States of America, which obviously exports a lot of food. But right now the big theme is avocados, because they're considering closing the Mexican border. And where are we going to get avocados for avocado toast? But all that is to say that the United States imports a lot of food, and so do other first world, very developed, happy countries that do not feel insecure about the fact that a lot of their food is coming from someplace where, outside their borders. And then the other thing is Russia, right? So self-reliance, whatever, security. But Russia is only cracking down on food imports. Mostly, not machinery, not biomedical equipment, right? That didn't come in under the counter sanctions. There are places, right? I don't know a ton about what Russia allows and doesn't allow in, but you can just go to a hospital here and see medical equipment that wasn't made in Russia. They're not. So why are they worried about food when other countries aren't? And why are they worried about food and not a lot of other important things, like smartphones that get imported and aren't made in Russia? Is there a smartphone that's made in Russia? Does anybody know? I don't think so. Okay, right. So they're just fine importing that. Let's look first at what wasn't the motivation, I think, for these sanctions. First, I don't think it was to destroy the European economy or the economy of the United States. Again, we talked about the fact that all of this is less than 1% of the GDP of every targeted country, even countries like Poland. And look at this. This is I don't know if you can read it, but it's the page of the permanent mission of the Russian Federation to the European Union. And what are they saying? They're saying European Union remains the leading trade partner of the Russian Federation. And we're proud of it, Skopkach. Here's all this stuff we're importing. Trade relations, they say, have recovered since the the unfortunate lull in 2015, 2016. even, this isn't on this page, even agricultural exports have basically recovered from the EU. They're just different products now. There's, like French wine, which thank God was not under the embargo. Otherwise, I might not have come here. And so hurting the EU economically was not really part of it. This person thinks Russia's import ban has failed. Why? Because Moscow's counter-sanctions against the West will not convince the EU or the US to seize their own sanctions against Russia. I don't think that was the motivation for it either, right? If you know it's not going to hurt them a ton economically, if it's not, it's just difficult to imagine that they thought this was a, leverage you could use to repeal the sanctions. And again, there's a question of, right, they make a big point, they being the Russian Foreign Ministry, we retain the right to asymmetrical response, right, to Western sanctions, which is important, right? They didn't blacklist a ton of, the corporate officers of McDonald's or the CEO of Walmart, in response to Russian oligarchs being added to a blacklist. Instead, they banned food imports for some reason. Okay, there's even, so smart people writing papers and talking about this say they're trying to diversify their economy away from oil. Right? We know Russia's worried about that. We know oil is a weakness because it's just a raw material. It's subject to fluctuations in price. A lot of oil is controlled by people who are friendly to the United States, which means that to some extent it's an actual, right, is a geostrategic liability, not just a market liability as to when the price fluctuates. But I don't think that's right either, because if you look at wheat, right, the biggest, right, we just said Russia's exporting so much wheat, isn't this amazing, adding so much to the GDP. Wheat basically follows the price of oil. Basically follows the price of oil. Now, remember that Tkachov quote earlier, wheat is literally a second oil. And the reason is that to transport wheat, you use petroleum. To fertilize wheat, you use petroleum. And to harvest the wheat, you use petroleum. Right? All of these things mean that the price of wheat really closely mimics the price of oil. And again, what I'm saying about oil, right, which is, I think, Russia's, and certainly was the Soviet Union's nightmare, it basically, right, the ruble is tied to oil. We know, right, this is just showing you that the kurs rubля, as it trades against the dollar, basically follows whatever the price is for a barrel of oil. That trend. Wheat prices in Russia and on the global market basically follow the kurs rubля, the trading of the ruble. Why do they follow the ruble? Why do global wheat prices follow the trend line for the Russian ruble? Because global wheat prices follow oil. Okay, so no, this isn't diversifying Russia's economy away from oil. That can't have been. It'll add a little bit to the GDP. Obviously, it's something you can continue to export once oil finishes, whenever that is. But wheat prices follow currency, and currency follows oil. A cynical point of view, which, right, as to what the motivation was, again, for food security, for sanctions, for import substitution, and I don't have a slide for it, says that the protectionism is trying to help out oligarchs. For example, Miratorg, which we know has connections to people, right, who are pretty high up, whom I won't name, and other, right, big players. Right, Russia's agricultural industry is controlled by quite a few big players. Isn't it possible that they have a powerful lobby that got, and they're getting a выгода, they're getting something from this. But this is a slightly more tenable line of argument. But again, I don't think so, and I don't have hard evidence for why not. But Miratorg, for example, which now supplies, I think, a majority of Russia's meat, period, certainly a majority of Russian pork, was one of the biggest importers of meat before 2014. And they were developing their production. But when I talked to this guy I mentioned in the executive office at X5, right, one of the biggest retailers, he said that from his point of view, it makes sense that it's the government trying to adopt a strategy of food production. And the reason is that businessmen in Russia don't really like to make long investments in infrastructure, in production, all these, they don't like to do costly upgrades and switching their business around. Import is really easy. You buy something for one price, you sell it for another. It's easy to figure out, it's easy to start. And if you need to, right, because all you basically build, sometimes you don't even need to build them, you can just rent them, some kind of hub where you bring everything there and then you sell it from there. If something goes wrong, you can close up shop, you don't have tons of liabilities. And my idea is that the Russian producers have been experimenting with production for a long time, but that it's not necessarily the direction they would have headed in naturally, especially when there are a lot of countries that currently are a lot more efficient at producing food than Russia is, both because of the vast distances, infrastructure problems in Russia, labor issues, robotization, and all of that. To answer the argument that I just advanced, I don't think this was done for the food industry. I don't think the food industry in Russia was begging for this to be done. And what I want to propose, what I want to propose is that this was not done, this dream of self-sufficiency by 2022 is not following an economic logic. At least not entirely. I think there's an emotional logic to it, as well as maybe a historical logic. And so I'm reminding you of the way that I think Russians think about food differently from Americans, or even people in a lot of other countries. Right? For Russians, right, domestic supply, reliability, stability, and quotas for how much of it is going to be actually grown, how much food are we going to actually have inside the country. Again, the United States, USDA, is thinking about a global food network, right? Not so much about this boundary of where one country ends, another begins, and about that we want to improve economies in order that people could buy more food. And I told one of my friends about this idea, right? I tried to explain how we think about food in the United States, where I grew up, and he answered me very simply. He said, "Еда не товар." And I thought, whoa, food is not a commodity, right? And he immediately began to talk about the 1990s, which I've avoided talking about so far, but they're critical here. The 1990s when, I wasn't here. A lot of people are young enough in this room not to remember them. My father, I know, stood in line for cabbage and bread after school instead of doing his homework in Ulyanovsk. And I know that there are people in this room because I've spoken to them, I'm not just making a guess, who lived only on what was grown on their dacha and the US food aid, so powdered milk and chicken, that was brought into their schools. And this is, I would go so far as to say this is a national trauma. Right, I think any food shortage is, this one was especially. And the moment, right, it's first of all, if you realize this is what brought your civilization to an end, the Soviet Union, right, is that we were trading oil for food, we were exporting oil and buying food because the kolkhoz was just not producing enough. Then the price of oil tanked, no pun intended, and suddenly we couldn't buy food. And the whole system falls apart, and we're suddenly accepting a donation from who is supposed to be our biggest enemy, right, the United States, and they're bailing us out, right? And so if you think about it that way, but you don't even have to go. You don't have to go that far, right? Even if you don't think about politics. There's the generation in Russia that is currently raising kids remembers when their own parents, right, again, I'm not making this up, personal examples, and anybody who grew up here should know this, when their own parents went without food to feed them, right, for days on end, just to feed their own kids, they didn't eat, right? I mean, I would think that would create a different vision of food than we have in the United States, despite the fact that the US has people who have trouble buying enough to eat, and homeless and everything that. But this is on a national scale. And I think it influences every level of society and how they see food. So consumers, for example, walk into a grocery store today, even the shabbiest country store, just magazin produkty, and what is in that store? Not a lot. Sushki, konfeti, right? I mean, but they have fresh bread every day, and they have enough of it, and they have eggs. And if you're walking into that store to buy products, you're not thinking what some people in other countries think, which is, wow, the assortment here sucks. Of course, all of you live in Moscow, so you don't have to deal with it. I live in a place that has these kind of produkty magazin, and that's sometimes all there is. But you don't walk in and you think it sucks. You walk in and think, thank God it's not the 1990s. We're doing well. Look at all this stuff that's produced in Russia. If you're a grower of food, this is one of the people I talked to. Her name is Natalia Pinkova. She has an organic farm in Lipetsky rayon, in the Moscow region. And she grows a lot of delicious food. That's not actually how she makes her money. Her farm, she was hoping to break even this year. I have to call her and ask if she made it. She actually makes her money importing biomedical equipment. She's a businesswoman in Moscow. She only spends 1 day a week on this farm. And the idea for the farm, as she told it to me, came in 2008 when the ruble crashed and she was stuck, as she put it, between the hammer and the anvil. She was paying for imports in euros and trying to sell them in rubles. And she realized, right, that she was stuck. And what she wanted to do, she said, she wanted to put down roots, to invest in something, to grow something, to create something that wasn't subject to the fluctuations of the market. That not that, and so the idea here is, although she sells her food, right? But her food also has a non-market value. As in, it is not simply a price tag, it is also something you can eat. And something that in, a really bad economy, you can trade. Unlike a lot of other things. I was in Zimbabwe last year, and they have a clause that allows you to pay school fees in goats if you need to. If you can't afford, you bring a goat to school, and that's how you pay for school. And so, again, but why would a businesswoman who works in Moscow and drives a Lexus and probably lives in a splendid apartment be thinking about this? What she said is, what if there's a war? Что если будет война? At least I'll have some place to go. At least I'll have my onions and my potatoes. And what if there's hyperinflation? At least I'll have something to eat, and I'll be safe, and I'll have I'll bring my family and my friends. And I have heard a lot of farmers say that. A lot of farmers, not just who are, and not so much farmers who have, that's the only thing they do, but a lot of businessmen in Moscow. So most of the people, raise your hand if you've heard of Lavka before I mentioned it today. Okay, a small number of people. A lot of the people who supply Lavka, that, food cooperatives, other restaurants, Azbuka Vkusa, whatever, they aren't actually farmers. They're people who had a business in Moscow, and this is their investment. And very often they're losing money on it. And they're not doing it to make money. Despite how much they're charging you for the food when you walk into Vkusville, they're still not making money on it. They have an idea that this is security, social security, something that's going to protect them. It's a dimension to the farm-to-table movement that we don't have in the United States so much. It's not just hip, it's food security for these people. Kind of like a new dacha. Right, the dacha is not just a place where you relax, it's the place where you can store what you need for the winter, just in case there's not enough. Okay. Yes. And then you have the ruling elite. I didn't get a chance to interview the government, so no comment from them. But I mean, I can make a bet that they're traumatized by the 1990s when they saw, right, whether they were ruling at that time or not, when they see the oil price crash and there's no food for the country, and and Russia's basically hostage to, to the people giving them their food, the way they see it. And then you can go back. You can recall the revolution of 1917. Again, a crisis for providing food to the cities leads to massive discontent. Part of what leads to the revolution, and so you don't want to have. We have this, and here we are again in the 21st century, and we have the same vulnerability, right? We saw what the price of oil does to the Russian ruble. Where have we really moved forward? And if your job is to be professionally paranoid, right, especially if you used to work in the security services, you want to eliminate this weakness. You don't want to be like Novgorod, right? I'm sure none of them have ever read the Novgorod Primary Chronicle, but it's in the national consciousness. If you have this little place called Tarzhok, and somebody can just cut off your grain supply, no matter what, you don't want that. Just in case, and so I think the goal is to eliminate a problem that has plagued Russia for a long time, historically speaking, which is food shortages. It's not to make a ton of money exporting wheat, even though that's awesome, right? It's not to have farmers markets, everywhere. It's not any of the other things I mentioned that it's not. It's actually just so that if anything happens, right? If there's a war, if there's hyperinflation, we want to be sure that we have enough food for ourselves, and that'll get us through. And there's the thing that I will call the dacha mentality. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I don't know if any actual Russian would think of a dacha mentality, partly because it's such a normal thing. But this is taken from a paper written by a friend of mine. The dacha as an autonomous realm, right? Where food and land are healthier and people can survive and thrive regardless of political or of societal or political insecurity. Right? And this concept of the dacha, now most people in Russia don't have dachas anymore, especially people in this room who are young, right? They're moving to the cities. Babushka still lives on the dacha. Sometimes we go there if we're in a good mood, if we want to visit her. But mostly we don't have dachas. But when you see your country on a national level adopt the dacha mentality and say, our whole country is a dacha, right? This sort of island. Our whole country is a dacha, which is going to give us security for the bad times. That we're going to have our own food. We're going to grow it ourselves, and I think people feel good about that, and that's why they supported and continue to support this food embargo, despite its negative effect on food prices. And when I finish, you can tell me if I'm wrong about that. So, just like Великий Novgorod, Господин Великий Novgorod, right? Which is doing so well. They're beating the Suzdal people. They have God on their side. And what happens at the end? No food, no democracy, no veche, no lovely bell that we liked so much. It's gone. And these nimbai, right? These circles around the people, like I said before, they symbolize eternity, just like the Soviet Union, which was also supposed to be eternal. And both fell basically for the same reason. Okay, I'm almost done. This is the slide that tells you I'm almost done. But I want to talk about not just the motivations, but what I think might be the positive thing that this food embargo, these sanctions, or if we want to say the long history of import substitution is doing for Russia. And again, I'll remind you that I'm not an economist. So if you're an economist and think this is completely bogus, when I'm done, please tell me. But it has to do with regionalization. This is a map of the United States, and basically US GDP per region, right? So we have We have some variation, 2.1, 3.9, 1.2. Rocky Mountains aren't doing so well. That's because nobody lives there. Just skip that. West Coast, East Coast, I mean, New England 1 point. You can see that there's a lot of regional variation. All of the US economy is not tied up in one place, even though New York, right, is huge and San Francisco is huge. But it's spread out. It's spread out quite well. This is a map of the Russian Federation. It's not spread out, very well at all. 20.8 in the central region, right? 20.8 compared to 3.2, 6.1, right? It's not horrible. It's not 40 and then 1, 1, 1, 1, but it's not doing very well. This is share of federal districts in poultry and pig inventories, right? Just two of the products that are being produced on a large scale in Russia now. You can see it's pretty well dispersed, right? It's not it's not perfect. It's not equal, but it's dispersed a lot more than this map was. And so what I'd like to suggest is that the growth of agriculture in Russia is going to help diffuse economic power. And here is an area in I think where Americans and Russians, especially rural Americans and rural Russians, should really be able to understand each other. The idea of the island or of the dacha or whatever this theme is that we're drawing out is also the American idea of the pioneer. The pioneer that goes off in a wagon, leaves everything behind, and then you do everything for yourself, right? These American explorers who knew how to hunt, they knew how to fish, they knew how to trap, they knew how to grow food, they knew how to shoe a horse. They made their own clothes, right? And this idea of self-sufficiency hasn't gone away from the United States at all. I used to work on a farm when I was younger that was next door. One of my good friends, his dad owned this farm about 10 minutes away from me if you disregard the speed limit. And this was near Portland, Oregon, right? Portland, Oregon is one of the most progressive cities in America. This was just outside the city limits of one of the suburbs. And we'd come there, and the way he talked about his farm was, again, like it was an island. Like, here we are, and we have our beef. And if they come for our guns, and he had a lot of guns, right? I carried a rifle on that farm, even though I was literally next to city limits, and the only thing I ever shot with it was a rabbit. It was like, if they come for our guns, we'll be ready. We have, 20 rifles and then 30 pistols. Kind of ridiculous. But this idea, and we can feed ourselves, right? We have a farm. We'll feed ourselves if anything happens. In America, it's often the zombie apocalypse people are thinking of. But the zombie apocalypse kind of symbolizes anything that could happen. This quote talks about, it's a modern paper, Novgorod Republic's political ideal, which again, I know Russians aren't on a mass scale thinking about Novgorod, but it's still relevant. Their ideal was local self-sufficiency. They didn't get there because they had to import their grain from somewhere else. But that ideal, which they never forgot, is being compared here to the European ideal of subsidiarity, which in the United States is federalism. Right? Federalism, local self-sufficiency. And there's a big debate in the United States about federalism right now, and not everybody likes it. But again, it's an opportunity to understand, and I think it's an opportunity for the United States and the USDA and whoever else wants to really get involved in building a robust segment of the Russian economy. Europeans are already doing this on every level. I've met some of them. I've talked to people who know them. They're coming in here as consultants. They're coming in working in big ag. They're coming as farmers. They're training, right, that Russian cheesemaker who won the blind taste testing in France was trained by a French cheesemaker. Right? The French stopped making cheese for Russia, and they just came here and taught Russians how to do it. Which is fine. I don't see the United States taking that opportunity, because I think, look, I mean, it's no longer, we talked about the model the USDA has, right, which is about free trade, it's about economic buying power, import and export of food. I don't think the United States is going to be able to convince Russia to do that. We're not going to get to sell them anything. But building a strong regionalized economy, if it's possible, could help Russians, first of all, be better off economically, which would be great. Also take back control of local politics, because at the end of the day, money has a lot to do with power. And if the United States really does care about democracy, right, and not just capitalism, which I think they do, we should help Russia do that. Help Russia develop the rural regions. So, anyways, last slide. I'll just bring up something that a lot of people have also forgotten about or never knew about, Belovodye, which is the sort of equivalent of El Dorado, the place before the revolution where the Russian peasant wanted to go. And it actually turns out, when I started researching this, that there was basically a real place called Belovodye, and it was a community of old believers who were facing persecution, and they went out. And what you see in these stories of the mythology of Belovodye is that food security. So we grow all our own food, we make our own houses. We don't need anybody. Goes hand in hand with political freedom. Because in Belovodye, you don't have the Tsar, you don't have the Tsar's bureaucracy. You're ruled by bishops and archbishops of the old believers, who can be a lot stricter than the Tsar, but the old believers basically pick out their own clergy, unlike the Russian Orthodox Church of the modern day. And so that's all I want to say. This is perhaps what I closed with, is the only maybe controversial part of my talk, and the most hypothetical. And basically it's a big question, because again, a lot of agriculture in Russia, almost all of it, is controlled by a few major players. But again, if this actually revitalizes the regional economies and promotes local self-sufficiency, I think it'll be a good thing in the end.